Hallo zusammen und willkommen zurück auf Neutrality Studies. Mein Name ist
Hello,
Jochem
everyone, and welcome back to
ein
Neutrality
Professor
Studies.
an der
My name is
Universität
Pascal
Kyoto.
Lataz.
Bei
I'm an
mir
associate
heute
professor at Kyoto
Gastgeber
University.
Autor
And with me today
und
is
der
attorney and
sehr
author
gute
Erik Jochem,
Beobachtungen
who has made some very
der
insightful observations about the relationship between law, the state, and society.
Herr
Mr. Jochem,
Jochem.
welcome. Good day,
Guten Tag,
Mr.
Herr
Lataz.
Eurocrats.
Mr. Jochem,
Herr
we've been in
Jochem, Sie
contact
waren
by
im
email,
Austausch
and in those
Sie
conversations
den
you made a
Berichten
wonderful
geführt haben,
observation,
Sie eine
namely,
wunderbare Beobachtung
that the
gemacht,
issue
und
of
zwar,
EU
dass
sanctions has a
die
great deal to
Sanktionen
do
der
with
EU
sovereignty,
ganz
with claims of
etwas
sovereignty.
mit
Could you elaborate on that?
und Souveränitätsansprüchen. Könnten Sie das etwas ausführen?
Ja, ich fange mal so an,
Let me start like this. We were very shocked by these sanctions. For example, against Jacques Bode, the Swiss author and former NATO and UN employee, quite simply because we couldn't make sense of it at all. How something like that is even possible. Jacques Bode keeps saying there was no trial, he was never charged. He suddenly finds himself in a situation where he can no longer access his money, where he's no longer allowed to travel. By medieval standards, he's been ostracized, almost an outlaw, so to speak. And then the question arises, how can something like that even be explained?
Wie kann man so etwas überhaupt erklären? Ja? Normalerweise ist es ja so, dass wir in einem Rechtsstaat leben.
Normally, we live in a constitutional state, and there is the state's monopoly on the use of force, which is actually meant to protect us from violence. That's its purpose, its function. And we are all used to living in a critical society. It's also normally the case that we are protected from state violence within the framework of the rule of law. In Germany, for example, there is the basic law with its fundamental rights, which cannot simply be restricted. So within the state, there is also a system of protection against the state's own use of force, a kind of state protection system, so to speak.
Sozusagen.
And then it's difficult to make sense of what happened to Jacques Bode, and also to German journalists. And one probably has to say that what happened there no longer operates within the normal framework of the rule of law, but that the state has stepped outside that framework. And that's what is called a state of exception. So when it comes to Jacques Bode and others, we're talking about them being in a state of exception. That's something Carl Schmitt actually described in his book, The Concept of the Political, where he points out that the original task of politics is to distinguish between friend and enemy.
Die Aufgabe des Politischen ist es, Freund und Feind zu unterscheiden. Und das betrifft sowohl das Außen, das heißt den Krieg.
And that applies both externally, that is, to war, to the declaration of war against other nations. That essentially triggers this state of emergency outwardly, but also inwardly. It exists there too. The state can also declare who its enemy is within its own borders, and by doing so, it effectively suspends the normal legal protections for citizens. In Germany, that's not easily possible because we have a coherent legal system. It also hasn't happened in Germany that the federal government, as part of its foreign policy, has begun to deprive its own citizens of fundamental rights or to restrict them. That hasn't happened yet.
Eigenen Bürger Grundrechte zu entziehen oder die einzuschränken. Ja, das hat es noch nicht gegeben. Die EU macht das paradoxerweise.
Paradoxically, the EU is doing that. It can paradoxically do so within the framework of foreign and security policy, the common foreign and security policy. Within this framework, it began imposing sanctions against Russia. I think we're now at the 20th package, right? And if you try to put that into context, you have to say that this is an informal war against Russia that's being waged. There's no formal declaration of war, except for the one from Annalena Baerbock, who once let that slip. But in doing so, I think she actually described quite well the EU's mental state, which is, psychologically speaking, at war with Russia.
Tatsächlich also psychologisch im Krieg mit Russland befinden. Ja?
Und ich glaube, an der Stelle ist es einfach auch wichtig, nochmal zu sagen, dass
And I think at this point it's also important to say once again that these sanctions and this use of foreign policy and the very forceful methods of foreign policy, meaning deciding who gets sanctioned, who is subjected to these measures, are essentially warlike mechanisms. By trying to act against foreign agents or companies or whatever, to sink them, to harm the enemy. And then, following Carl Schmitt's theory, saying, okay, we have the power to decide who the enemy is, and that this instrument is then also turned inward to fight the internal enemy.
Nach innen gewendet wird, den inneren Feind zu bekämpfen, dass das also unter Schmitts
So under Schmitt's philosophy, this means that the EU is taking it upon itself to decide who is friend and who is enemy for all member states, and ultimately to seize that sovereign power for itself, just as it has already seized the monopoly over the airspace of European states. That's not actually codified anywhere, for example in the Lisbon Treaty. The EU just took it, and now it's simply doing it. And in the same way, with the sanctions, it's acting over the heads of the member states, but unfortunately not against their interests. The German federal government has made it clear that it's quite fine with this happening.
Also, ich bin mir nicht ganz sicher, ob wir.
Well, I'm not entirely sure whether this is a case of the EU grabbing power, or whether it's simply inherent in the fact that it is indeed responsible for common security and foreign policy. That follows from its own self-conception. But the question is, who can deny it that authority? Yes, under the treaties. It's not as if it had no legal basis for it. The foreign ministers make decisions within the framework of this foreign and security policy. And that's very important. It's the Council of the European Union, not the Commission that did this. Exactly. It's basically the foreign ministers who do it. Yes, but within the EU framework. And that's of course very important for the legal protection of the people who are being sanctioned, because it's not clear whether they can obtain any legal protection at all.
Sehr wichtig, weil nicht klar ist, ob sie überhaupt Rechtsschutz erhalten können. Ja?
Ja, weil eben der Rechtsschutz ist dazu da,
Yes, because legal protection exists to protect citizens, not only from other citizens, but also from the state. And that's exactly what Thomas Hobbes's theory, the Leviathan, is about. The monopoly on power, but also the citizens' rights of defense against the state, which can be asserted in court and are highly developed, with various levels and procedures. And precisely this rule of law, this legal protection, these different layers, have now simply been bypassed. They went around it and are now using foreign policy to go after these people, just as they try to harm people abroad through this instrument. And that is, from a rule of law perspective, highly precarious, isn't it?
Rechtsstaatlich gesehen höchst prekär, oder?
Es ist ja einfach die Frage, wenn Sie im Ausnahmezustand.
The question is simply this. When you're in a state of emergency, you're no longer under the rule of law. To put it very bluntly, if the federal government were to declare war on Russia today, you'd have no way to challenge that in court. The war would just be there. The war would simply exist by virtue of the declaration. That means there's a sphere, and the Federal Constitutional Court of Germany has always said this as well. There's an autonomous area of political judgment belonging to the federal government into which the judiciary will never intervene. It's a kind of immunity, if you will.
Das ist eine Art Immunität, wenn Sie so wollen. Ja? Das ist rechtlich nicht zu überprüfen, sagt das Bundesverfassungsgericht.
That cannot be legally reviewed, says the Federal Constitutional Court. That's separation of powers. Politics has one. The executive has an autonomous sphere that cannot be legally reviewed. And that could ultimately be the case here as well, that the EU has an autonomous sphere because security and defense policy have been transferred to it. It may have its own sovereign domain. Yes, that's the term. And it's not subject to control. It's not subject to control. That's deus ex machina, or whatever you want to call it. Yes, that's the absolute, yes, that's the bare face of power, if you will.
Ja, das ist das blanke Angesicht der Macht, wenn Sie so wollen.
Richtig, also es entwächst aus der Macht natürlich.
Right, so it naturally arises from power, and that's why it's a political process. On the other hand, you're right. When a state declares war, war exists, period. But according to the legal understanding, including international law, the moment war is declared or actually exists, the laws of war apply, or as it's called today, international humanitarian law. So it's not that there's a lawless space, rather, there's a different legal framework that should then be applied.
Praxis, die dann angewendet werden sollte. Jetzt in dem Fall mit den Sanktionen aber.
Now, in the case of the sanctions, but I think we haven't developed anything on that yet. Or could one make the argument that the sanctioned individuals should actually fall under international humanitarian law? I think that's a very academic question, if I may put it that way. All right, we can set that aside, but it's more about the legal framework, which law actually applies. Because even when war breaks out, international humanitarian law still applies. To what extent can that mechanism be switched off? And yet people are being killed. Yes, but international humanitarian law does not prohibit killing. It restricts it.
Ja, das ist, also, ich meine, insoweit ist also, ich meine, und im...
Yes. I mean, in normal times, they're not allowed to kill. Yes, that's right. The prohibition on killing is thus lifted. The prohibition on killing outwardly is lifted. They can still argue about what happens with civilians, but in modern wars, they always suffer, almost automatically. And that also applies internally. Internally, too, the state of emergency prevails. That means anyone they convict of or accuse of collaborating with the enemy will, under martial law at home and under harsher conditions, no longer have normal legal protection.
Auch keinen normalen Rechtsschutz mehr haben. Ja, das ist, da gibt es dann eigene Prozeduren.
There are specific procedures for that, like in the case of Filbinger, the former minister-president of Baden-Württemberg, who in the final days of the war had some soldiers executed for desertion or something like that. And that was considered lawful, so to speak. That was the law for us. Yes, that was legal, yes. So it's difficult to capture these things. I would say that to some extent we actually step outside the normal legal order. And then, gradually, one might say, if you claim that international humanitarian law still applies, that's true. Those are, so to speak, mitigations, yes.
Das ist so. Das sind Abmilderungen sozusagen, ja. Es ist nicht ganz...
It's not exactly the jungle, but there are still rules there. People try to find rules, but violence has been unleashed. The situation is no longer contained. Whether one adheres to international humanitarian law or not may also depend on whether one wants to win or not. Yes, Mr. Trump might not necessarily stick to it under certain circumstances. I mean, just recently, right, Mr. Berger wrote something on the Nachdenkseiten about the U.S. in Aleppo, how they bombed the city to pieces. The civilian population, well, they were just wiped out. Yes, all of that is completely disproportionate, really. But so what? Yes, they do it. It's terrible, but...
Of
course, but the question is about the use of violence and escalation, that the EU is now beginning to use violence against its citizens, or rather, people who live in the EU. So Jacques Bourg is Swiss, not an EU citizen, but a resident of the EU. That it is starting to do this, and in that sense is now demarcating the enemy and claiming this right for itself, and has already announced that more could or might follow.
Mehr folgen kann oder könnte. Also der Sprecher des Außenministeriums, also des deutschen Außenministeriums.
So, the spokesperson for the German Foreign Ministry has announced that anyone spreading Russian propaganda should now think twice about what they're doing, because there could be more to come. So, it's on the table that this exposure of the enemy will continue. And we've already seen this in other states of emergency, especially during the pandemic, I think, where people start to wonder who still has access to legal protection and who just ends up getting crushed.
Ja, natürlich. Das ist ein Mechanismus.
Yes, of course. That's a mechanism at work there, mainly through moralization. That means through black and white thinking. Politics is moralized in order to be able to exercise power. That's also a form of self-empowerment by politics. It was ultimately the same during the pandemic, when you had the feeling that certain politicians took great pleasure in seeing the camera focused on them. You're hanging on my every word. Read my lips. What the next measure will be. That's self-empowerment, also on the part of politicians. Why does the EU do that? Why does the EU seize these rights, or, as you say, grab them for itself? I would say it's exercising them.
Man könnte ja sagen, es gibt eine gewisse Hemmung, diese Dinge
One could say there's a certain reluctance to engage in such actions because we come from a constitutional state. How do we come to suddenly apply such measures? Everyone can see that, in a way, it's disproportionate, that it's basically just meant to cause harm. The idea that Russia would somehow be worse off because Shakbo is now supposed to be silenced, ultimately he's being excluded. Why is the EU doing this? And I would say, in that respect, I'd agree with you. The EU is doing it to demonstrate its sovereignty. That's how I'd put it. The same goes for all the sanctions against Russia.
So würde ich das sagen, ja. Auch die ganzen Sanktionen gegen Russland, die EU formiert sich und die EU hat diesen Krieg
The EU is taking shape, and it is using this war against Russia as a means to become sovereign by exercising these sovereign rights extensively. That is the common foreign policy. You had the Hungarian diplomat with you, who explained how Hungary is also participating in the sanctions so as not to jeopardize the common foreign policy. In some cases, Hungary is acting against its own interests, but still joins the sanctions against Russia because there is a dynamic in which the EU is trying to break free as a sovereign entity. I had sent you a link. This is an excerpt from the diary of Alberto Spinelli.
Aus dem Tagebuch von Alberto Spinelli. Das ist ein ehemaliger Kommissar.
That's a former commissioner of the European communities, so from the 1950s and 1960s. In 1953, he wrote, the EU depends on the continuation of the Cold War. That's practically its reason for existence, so it's a child of the Cold War. And he said that if the EU really wants to establish itself, it needs a war against the Soviet Union, and we have to wage it at the right time. That's what he said in 1953. Yes, and that means what we actually have now is the EU is trying to become sovereign. It's trying, if you will, it's searching for its identity. Yes, sovereignty and identity have a lot to do with each other.
Souveränität und Identität hat auch viel miteinander zu tun. Es hat übrigens unser Freund.
By the way, our friend, if I may call him that, Josep Borrell said in his famous garden speech, "It's the identity, stupid." That's what he said there. And even then, it was directed against Russia. Of course it was directed against Russia. Europe is the paradise. The garden is the paradise. And he argues there that an identity struggle has broken out here, practically with the war in Russia or the war in Ukraine. And I said from the very beginning that this is a war over sovereignty that Russia is waging, because it is fighting for its own sovereignty, namely to say, I don't want anyone at my border who can threaten me in such a way that they can blackmail me. That, in the end, is sovereignty. Stay away from my borders.
Das ist ja die Souveränität letzten Endes. Bleib mir weg von meinen Grenzen. Ja?
And it is also an anti-colonial war of sorts. But this war for sovereignty, in turn, triggers sovereignty movements within the EU. And that's why the EU also needs this supposed threat from Russia, which in reality doesn't exist. That is, of course, Russia has no intention of attacking either the EU or NATO. But rhetorically, the EU has to say so, because otherwise it won't become sovereign. It defines itself in opposition, so to speak. It needs this adversary against which it defines itself in order to achieve sovereignty. And that is essentially a process of finding sovereignty. In addition, we have Germany, by the way, which is also trying to become sovereign. Germany has not been sovereign since 1945. We all know that, with the United States still present in Germany.
No, there are still several tens of thousands of US troops there. But if you don't call them occupation forces but allies instead, then everything's fine. It's all a matter of framing.
Alles im Framing, aber gut.
Ja, genau. Gut, das ist genau. Also wie
All right. Yes, exactly. What you call it is another matter. What I saw recently, Mr. Scherpenberg, to name the author, wrote a book about megalomania, German megalomania, and says that the Americans are stationed in Europe, or rather in Germany. The real reason behind that is to keep Germany and France from going for each other's throats.
That's also the argument made by Americans like John Mearsheimer, that the United States is still an offshore balancer, as it's often called. In other words, that it keeps the Europeans more or less together and also away from the theory. So in fact, it should be in Russia's interest that this doesn't change. But let's just leave it at that.
Aber lassen wir das mal in den Raum.
Genau, das ist noch so eine andere Sache. Ich wollte
Exactly, that's another issue. I wanted to bring that up as well. So now we have the EU trying to become sovereign, essentially taking sovereignty away from the nation-states in order to become sovereign itself. Germany is trying to become sovereign. I will make us the greatest military power in Europe, says Mr. Merz. Something that would have been completely unthinkable after 1945. How did we get here? Don't we have some kind of history with this? Just to reiterate, we already had the big framework with Spinelli. Let's go back further to the French period, to the time of the German occupation of France. How did the French justify collaboration back then? They said, Germany is building the new Europe.
Da hat man gesagt, Deutschland baut das neue Europa.
Ja,
baut das neue Europa und der Krieg.
Germany is building the new Europe, and the war against Russia is the war for Europe, for civilization, against the Asians and the hordes. But we already have there the idea of Europe under German leadership. Under German leadership in France, mind you. And that is basically this double game. I mean, who is the EU? The EU is ultimately, one can argue about it, perhaps not nominally, but it is Germany. In fact, the EU is Germany's cloak of invisibility. That means the sovereignty that flows to the EU actually flows to Germany.
Ja, die fließt eigentlich zu Deutschland. Diese gemeinsame Außenpolitik gegen Russland und so weiter und so fort.
This joint foreign policy against Russia and so on and so forth is actually a German policy. In other words, Germany is also elevating itself, so to speak, by invoking the Russian threat in order to restore, in a sense, the pre-1945 condition. And why is Germany able to do that? That's actually quite a complicated process. It began in 1990, when the country started to position itself very deliberately as anti-Semitic and to distance itself from its National Socialist past. By chance, I found a text of mine from 2014 yesterday, where this was already a topic.
Wo das schon ein Thema war, dass man sich eben
Beat Klarsfeld, who slapped Kissinger because of his alleged involvement with the Nazis, was awarded the Federal Cross of Merit in 2014. Germany, just think about that for a moment, gave Beat Klarsfeld the Federal Cross of Merit, the very woman who once publicly slapped the representative of the Federal Republic of Germany. And that's how far it goes. We want to show the world that National Socialism was something utterly terrible. But at the same time, we say, mea maxima culpa. We present ourselves as an example to the world in this moral condemnation of what exists. That's why Israel is also a matter of state policy.
And just for everyone listening who doesn't speak German, the Chancellor of Germany literally said that Israel's existence is a matter of state for Germany. So that's not an exaggeration. That's what he said. That's what Miss Merkel said. Miss Merkel said it exactly like that. Yes.
And the others keep repeating it to this day. The others repeat it, exactly.
Up to that point. So, we're now going too far into this maximalist. What did our colleague Mr. Meller call it? He used a nice word for it. This self-accusation. One goes so far in the pride over guilt, in this guilt pride. One goes so far that one even takes partial responsibility for another genocide, just to wash one's hands clean of the last one. And with this approach, would you say Germany is now managing to acquire sovereignty within the EU?
So Germany is going to build the largest armed force, or wants to build it, but it won't deploy it on its own, only through the EU at most. After all, the EU is also responsible for trade policy, and then the EU will have to, something it has already announced, protect trade routes around the world, and so on and so forth. And that's where Germany will gladly make EU troops available. So in the end, it's a kind of game.
Ja, das ist also so ein Spiel letzten Endes. Deutschland sagt, ihr wisst ja, ich
Germany says, I'm actually, I've said goodbye to National Socialism and have no interests of my own. Only the EU does that as part of its peace mission. It's allowed to, so to speak. It's kind of played indirectly in the end. That's the continuity of the Second World War. That in France there was already this justification. We're building Europe, they're building Europe. And German aggression is only in the name of Europe. That's why I think the EU is so important for Germany.
Die EU ebenso wichtig für Deutschland
Ja,
letzten Endes. Ja.
Dieser Mechanismus ist so etwas von praktisch und das bringt uns zurück auf diese.
This mechanism is so convenient, and that brings us back to the sanctions. At the federal press conference, when Florian Warweg asked the spokesperson of the German Foreign Ministry how the ministry views these sanctions against EU citizens, the spokesperson said, "That's an EU issue. You'll have to ask the EU. We're not responsible for that." You could see the delight in his smile, because they've found a perfect tag team game here. But it's fairly clear, even though Germany, of course, codified the implementation of the sanctions into law again last week.
Auch weiter in Gesetz gegossen hat letzte Woche, dass also Deutschland ist absolut happy damit.
So Germany is absolutely happy that this is coming down from the EU, or rather, they're participating in it themselves. And here you can identify the enemy, meaning you can point to the internal enemy. And we also know that for France, well, Nathalie Jamp was chosen by the French to be on the list now. Whoever Indigro chose was probably Germany again. But it's always the middle states that then launder these acts through the EU.
Ja, genau. Ich meine, Sie müssen sie respektieren.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you have to respect them. They apply. That's directly applicable law, I mean. But that means there's probably another directive, I think, that says you have to take measures to make sure our sanctions actually have an effect, so to speak, and aren't circumvented. Yeah, and that's what's being implemented now, so to speak. Some people then say that's a crime, like in Germany, with a longer prison sentence if you slip Jacques Poe 10 euros. And in other countries, it's just an administrative offense, which is a huge difference. But you can see, so to speak, who's standing ready for action here.
Gewehr bei Fuß steht, sozusagen.
The nation state serves the EU's regulation and its functioning.
Genau, ja. Und ist aber andererseits, der Nationalstaat ist andererseits die.
Exactly, yes. And on the other hand, the nation state is conversely the EU, the sovereign. The sovereign is the EU, but it is being directed. And we have, if you look at the Hungarians, Hungary takes part in the EU's common foreign policy and puts its own interests aside because it's a joint project. Imagine if Germany had said, go ahead. That would have come from Germany, directly from Germany to Hungary. Please cut off your gas imports from Russia, or whatever it was about. Hungary would have said, you're Germany, I'm Hungary. What are you trying to tell me?
Ich bin Ungarn. Was willst du mir sagen? Ja? Aber über die EU, wenn das über die EU gespielt wird, ist das die Familie.
But when this is done through the EU, it's like a family doing things together, and then there's peer pressure, and that's when it all works. So it's very smooth, if you will. I'm not exactly sure how we are on time. I just wanted to take this in a completely different direction. So regarding this identity, or as one might say in English, joined at the hip relationship between Germany and the EU, the interplay you mentioned, one way to illustrate it is this. If Zelensky now says he would like Ukraine to join the EU quickly by 2027, then Germany would have achieved a war aim from 1914 if that happens.
Wenn das passiert. Denn im Ersten Weltkrieg war es schon so, dass die Ukraine zu Deutschland.
Because even during World War I, the idea was that Ukraine should belong to Germany. That was a war aim. Ukraine was then separated in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, that is, between Germany and Russia, so it was already detached once. And then, if you look at it, Fritz Fischer, a German historian, calls Ukraine during this transitional phase a German vassal state. Then Ukraine is lost again because the Soviet Union emerges. And then Hitler comes along, and Ukraine is supposed to return, so to speak, to the German sphere of influence. So it has always been a goal of German foreign policy to somehow bring Ukraine in.
Die Ukraine irgendwie reinzubekommen, ja? Und wenn wir die in der EU haben, ja,
And once they're in the EU, German companies will move there. That's completely obvious. That's what will happen. Then Ukraine will finally become a German economic zone, and then, so to speak, the circle will be complete. Over 100 years later, a bit more. And that's the interplay. Germany ultimately needs the EU as a kind of cover-up, if you will, to keep pursuing all these things. To pick up on that again, Fritz Fischer, there's that very short essay by Fritz Fischer, Hitler was no accident. You can probably find it online if you want to take a quick look.
Findet man bestimmt im Netz auch, ja, wenn man sich das kurz anschauen will. Und da sagt eben ganz klar, okay, Hitler hat...
And he said quite clearly, okay, Hitler, especially the racial ideology, or rather the excesses of the racial ideology, with the extermination of the Jews, and so on. In that respect, he's an outlier, possibly. In everything else, he's not an outlier. He represents continuity in German politics. In particular, Hitler also says, in a kind of dispute with the conditions of 1914, the Germans always got it wrong. They wanted overseas colonies, but our real colony is Russia. That's the idea. The German colony lies in the east. Yes, and that extends all the way to the oil in the Caucasus. They also hoped they could make a breakthrough there to continue the war.
Dass man da einen Durchbruch machen kann, dann den Krieg fortzusetzen. Aber jedenfalls, das ist also, man hatte koloniale Absichten gegenüber.
But in any case, there were colonial ambitions toward Russia, which is why Russia still somehow has the impression today that there's a continuity there, if you look at all the discussions about division and partition and so on. This phrase, Hitler was not an accident, can be used perfectly to say, Germany focuses everything on Hitler. And by essentially blanking out this whole colonial policy toward the East, that topic doesn't come up at all. It's only about the persecution of the Jews and the Holocaust. That's the German issue. That's what is said, and by Germany countering that as a singular problem and proving its credibility there, everything else, the entire continuity in which Hitler stood, ceases to be an issue.
Kein Thema.
Ja, und jeder, der deutsches Fernsehen oder deutschsprachiges Fernsehen...
And anyone who watches German or German-language television in Switzerland can pay attention to how World War II is portrayed. Germany was liberated by the Americans. The 26 million dead Soviet citizens are not a topic. The 6 million murdered Jews are a matter of state policy, or have become one. But the 26 million dead Soviet citizens are not. When the German government commemorates Auschwitz today, it commemorates the liberation, meaning the end. They never say who liberated it, because it would be embarrassing to have to say, yes, it was the Red Army that liberated Auschwitz, not the Americans. But the connection is always made with liberation by America. And it's tragic, but in that sense, as you're describing it now, the continuity and the war in the East, this simply has an 80 or 100-year history. Yes.
Eine 80-jährige, 100-jährige Geschichte, ja.
Ja, genau, also tatsächlich es gibt auch ein
Yes, exactly. There's also a more recent book. The author's name escapes me at the moment, but it's about the War of Annihilation. In Germany, it's also officially referred to as a historical term, the War of Annihilation against Russia. So it wasn't a normal war, it was a war of annihilation. The goal was to kill 30 million Russians. That was the objective, to create space, to eliminate the eaters, so to speak. That was the plan in the East. And it's even the case that, if you look at it this way, the West had been pacified, France was occupied, then they turned against Russia and became so brutal there, against the so-called subhumans, including the Jewish subhumans, that this brutality was practically re-imported and applied in the West as well. So that's when Jews were also deported from France and taken to Auschwitz and so on. That means that during the campaign against Russia, Germany lost its moral bearings. That's when the loss of civilization occurred, which of course also claimed the lives of many Russians, not just Jews. Yes, that is, of course, being concealed. You're absolutely right about that. And reinterpreted. Yes, it's almost Orwellian. We're just rewriting history for a moment. Yes, and that's the kind of thing we're seeing. But with the war in Ukraine, well, for me personally, it was like this. When the war in Ukraine began, I thought, I didn't know it was possible to lie like that.
habe ich gedacht, ich wusste nicht, dass man so lügen kann. Also das ist wie eine körperliche Erfahrung, die ich gemacht
It's like a
habe.
physical experience I had. And I said, I didn't know you could lie like that in politics. That the whole backstory and so on isn't told, even though it was all knowable. You could have known it from Jacques Bode, by the way, how this conflict actually began. So this distortion of history, the Americans as the great liberators and nothing else, is just one piece of the whole propaganda avalanche that has swept over us. What's also interesting, which would support my thesis, is this so-called turning point from Scholz. I mean, he pulled that out of a drawer from one day to the next.
That was an essay in foreign policy, or foreign affairs, where he published it. Okay, I think, if I remember correctly, yes.
Ja, genau. Und dieses Ding, das hat schon lange in der Schublade.
Yes, exactly. And this thing had been sitting in the drawer for a long time. It wasn't some sudden inspiration. Germany had been itching to move since 2014, 2015, saying, we need to get off the sidelines, we need to get onto the field. So I've always found it strange, suddenly, from one day to the next, a great idea. The term, of course, dramatizes it. But basically, there's a long-term plan behind it. If you include Mr. Miller's point, he says that after 1990, it started with guilt pride, meaning that an alibi was created. Focus everything on Hitler and say we deeply regret that. And apart from that, we have no interests. The EU is peaceful and so on and so forth, and we supposedly have no interests anymore. But in reality, Germany continues doing what it has always done.
Ja, macht man das weiter, was Deutschland eben immer gemacht hat.
Ja. Und eben, man macht es zum Teil versteckt in dem Sinne, dass man es nicht an die große Glocke hängt.
And they do it partly in a hidden way, in the sense that they don't make a big public announcement about it. On the other hand, they clearly follow a set line. I remember well. In 2019, Ursula von der Leyen became president of the European Commission for the first time. I believe it was 2019. And as a former minister, she was Minister of Defense under Angela Merkel. She proudly declared as Commission President that this would be the first geopolitical commission. The geopolitical commission, that was her thing. So to say here, yes, we are now going to expand the EU geopolitically, not just economically. And they did it to that extent. And as Minister of Defense, to go that far, well, the interconnections and the intent are fairly clear.
Yes, that clearly speaks in favor of it. And the nice thing is the naivety of the other Europeans. You really have to...
I've let the gentleman's speech sink in, so to speak, that Germany is simply purified. Yes, exactly.
Well, twice. A third time. No. Yes, exactly. Third time's the charm. Third time's the charm. Exactly. So, I mean, that's of course what that Germany, I love Germany so much that I'd like to see two of them thing was about. That was French. I think Pierre Morat or someone like that said it. So after the war, right? And maybe to get to that in the remaining time, the thing was that people said, okay, Germany is reunified. We know that, yes, that could cause some difficulties. There was a bit of an uneasy feeling about it. Thatcher and Mitterrand had an uneasy feeling about it.
Thatcher und Mitterrand hatten ein flaues Gefühl dabei. Aber Frankreich hat gesagt, okay, dann gebt ihr mal bitte die D-Mark ab.
But France said, okay, then please give up the Deutsche Mark. We want your commitment to Europe. You're so strong now. You're the most populous country. So please give up the Deutsche Mark as a gesture of humility. And what did they get? They got the Deutsche Mark for everyone in the form of the euro. So that means France got a symbol. The official name for the euro was ECU, European Currency Unit. And the ECU, of course, is an old French coin. So the French were naturally very pleased and happy.
Sehr zufrieden und glücklich. Ja, also man ist dann immer erstaunt letzten Endes, also wie dieser deutsche Durchbruch.
In the end, one is always amazed at how this German advance works. And yes, we'll have to see what comes out of it in the end. So, in the end, Germany is factoring things in for when Ukraine joins. And that brings me back to this Borrell article. He gave that speech at the European Diplomatic School in Bruges. They set it up there. Mogherini is the director, and Ukrainians are being trained there as European diplomats. That's what the article says. And that makes everything clear. The EU has already priced Ukraine in. Ukraine will join, and the German-led EU will then border Russia. That will be the end of the story.
Das Ende vom Lied sein. Also das ist so die.
Ich bin sehr froh, dass Sie das so.
I'm very glad you put it that way, because what we sometimes get wrong in this YouTube podcaster bubble is that we get carried away with these wishful ideas. And one of them is that the EU is finished, that it's breaking apart, crumbling, and weak. But if you take a closer look, you have to say, no, actually, this is helping the EU's unification, under the leadership of a relatively small clique that even manages to override domestic legal processes through sanctions and whatever else, thereby seizing power. And in doing so, power triumphs over law, which ultimately is the locus of power and represents real authority.
But Mr. Lataz still has a bit of water in his wine. Law is founded on force.
Das Recht ist auf Gewalt gegründet, ja.
Law is founded on violence, yes, but the limitation and compartmentalization of violence, and you can now trace this quite clearly, are currently disappearing before our eyes. Or rather, it still exists. The rule of law still exists. The spokesperson of the German Foreign Ministry even says that legal recourse remains available. So there's the fig leaf.
Man hat das Feigenblatt.
Ja, genau. Also ich meine, was immer der Rechtsweg ist in diesem Fall.
Yes, exactly. Whatever the legal recourse is in this case, that's really just a figure of speech at first. Where is this legal recourse anyway? We could sum it up like this. The big winner of the war in Ukraine is the EU. And we could say that the EU, under this wonderful pretext, if you look at it, this foreign and security policy in the treaties, is supposedly all about making the world a better place. The European peace project is now being used, even outside the EU, to carry out missions that are meant to bring peace to the world. As Borrell says, Europe is paradise, and really everyone just wants paradise. This wonderful pretext conceals the fact that Europe may have imperial interests that it attributes to Russia.
And we'll bring you paradise, with our bombs.
Ja, genau.
Geht ins Paradies.
Yes, exactly. Go to paradise. Exactly, yes. And if it's not the bombs, then you'll get the euro instead. You'll get this whole economic regime that Mr. Borrell calls paradise-like conditions in Europe. Poverty keeps increasing in Europe, but Mr. Borrell claims that Bruges, that diplomatic school, is a reflection of this paradise, where the Eurocrats sit, receive their salaries, and benefit from it. And for them, it's wonderful. It's a paradise. And in that sense, he's right. But the rest of Europe looks worse and worse, that has to be said. With the euro, everything, well, Europe, the nation-states, Italy, France.
Italien, Frankreich, ja. Und gut, Deutschland ist immer schon auf Austerität aus, ja, weil das.
Germany has always been focused on austerity because tightening the belt is the German specialty. That's basically the story. Yes, and let's see whether this final conflict ever comes to an end. But the EU has developed into a pseudo-sovereign entity, though I'd like to add a small caveat. It's ultimately not a state. So maybe the whole thing is actually unstable, a fragile construction. What happens when von der Leyen is no longer there? So in that sense, it's not really settled in the end.
Ja, in dem Sinne am Ende. Ja.
Das Ding ist, Europa, historisch gesehen.
The thing is, historically, Europe has always worked that way. Larger structures built on smaller ones. For example, the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation was one case. The papal construct around Italy, the Papal States, would be another. So there are various examples where top-down structures emerge, try to exercise sovereignty, and it's always a struggle. We're really just in the latest version of that. The question is whether it will develop into a truly draconian interpretation or into some kind of balance, negotiation, and so on. Unfortunately, at the moment, it's heading in the wrong direction. But Mr. Jochem, thank you very much. Those were all wonderful thoughts, and I'm very grateful for them. For people who want to read more of your work, where should they go?
Mehr von Ihnen lesen möchten, wo sollen die hingehen?
Also ich habe veröffentlicht eigentlich auf Makroskop.
So, I published it, actually on Macroscope, That's an economics magazine, in the Keynesian tradition, if you will. And on the Nachdenkseiten, where you can also currently find, as of yesterday, my article on Jacques Bourg. You can also find some old pieces under my name from 2014 on German war, German normality, back to war. That's where you'll find it.
Ja, da findet man das also.
I'll try to put the links below in the video description. Mr. Attorney Erik Jochem, thank you very much for your time.
Vielen Dank, Herr
Thank you
Lotaz.
very much, Mr. Lotaz. Maybe until next time. Take care.
Alles gut.